The divisive leader of a would-be F1 team that bears his name has stepped down, but could it lead to a second chance to bring a General Motors-backed Cadillac-branded entry onto the grid? Michael Andretti has stepped back from direct leadership of the Andretti Global team after deciding it's time now to pass the baton to his business partner Dan Towriss. It's not entirely clear what Andretti's claim that he will take a more strategic role will actually mean in real terms, not to mention who will take on overall leadership of the various Andretti initiatives that Michael was ultimately responsible for, even if they had other day-to-day superiors. And the fact he remains engaged and will continue to serve as a strategic advisor and key ambassador might only mean he has more time to focus on the F1 project in the background, assuming it doesn't go in another direction with GM and Cadillac, which we'll explain in this video. Regardless of the specifics, the leader of an eponymous organisation shuffling into a different role and a new person in the top job when that organisation is still trying to get into F1 is a big development. It'll be a while before we see whether it influences the impasse with Formula 1 management or not, especially with a legal case underway. FOM owner Liberty has confirmed it is being investigated in the US following its rejection of the Andretti Cadillac F1 entry about whether doing so violates antitrust laws designed to protect open competition. F1 doesn't seem that worried, as most major US sports are governed by tight controls over entries, but Andretti's supporters have whipped up too much of a political storm for it to be ignored. That final point helps underline why Andretti is considered so divisive, hence a leadership change could be significant for the F1 project and F1's chances of getting GM on the grid, given the massive US manufacturer was the part of the original Andretti pitch that F1 seemed most interested in anyway. Michael Andretti has some high-profile allies, and in F1 circles his biggest is probably McLaren Racing CEO Zak Brown, but Andretti is also known to rub people up the wrong way. He's lacked the diplomatic touch that might have made his organisation's relationship with F1 a little more productive. Remember, it was Michael Andretti who seemed to talk himself out of a Sauber takeover deal in 2021 and was wandering around the Miami F1 paddock back in 2022 before there was even a process open to evaluate new entries, trying to get all the existing teams to sign a document backing an Andretti F1 team. Spoiler alert, he failed. That was the start of a confrontational approach with FOM. And on top of getting under people's skin, whether that's with F1 or other teams or places outside F1 altogether like in IndyCar, Andretti was also not necessarily the right person to manage a massive organisation hands-on. He's grown it impressively, but managing a large workforce is not said to be his forte. Andretti Global's headcount is already in the hundreds, having added the fledgling F1 program to its existing racing endeavours, and a full-scale F1 effort would multiply that a couple of times over. For that to properly succeed, a top-level rearrangement was probably necessary, and remember, FOM considered the likelihood of the team succeeding to be a key factor in its decision. Under Andretti's leadership, F1 was clearly not convinced, and the more Andretti's done without actually progressing with getting the entry it has so far been denied, the more curious things have looked. Right now, Andretti Global has an active development team, a car in a wind tunnel, and a nascent engine program with General Motors. It has spent a huge amount of money on all of this, including a $200 million base in Indiana that will be the F1 program headquarters, but it also has a functioning and growing UK satellite facility. Persevering with the F1 preparation, despite being rejected, was a conscious Michael Andretti strategy, all in anticipation of that eventually being resolved in his favour, despite FOM showing no outward signs of reconsidering, which didn't exactly help with all the unresolved tensions. Ultimately, whether you agreed with him or not, none of what Michael Andretti did succeeded in getting his team on the F1 grid, and he's been trying for years. He also lost his biggest political ally when FIA President Mohammed Ben Sulayem went from vocally supporting an Andretti Cadillac entry to sharing the FOM party line that they should just try to buy an existing team. Andretti was the figurehead and the name behind this project while it failed to pull off its biggest move, but don't expect F1 to publicly welcome this with an "oh of course we'll let Andretti Cadillac in now," because that would just be an admission that this was a personal issue after all. The key to what comes next will likely be whether Andretti retains any involvement, whether this impacts the direction Andretti Global and GM take, and how F1 will view all of that. The management setup is significant. Dan Towriss, who is the boss of a group of various companies that support Andretti, is potentially a more appropriate leader. Then there is Mark Walter, the Guggenheim CEO, who is an Andretti investor and has money in other sporting initiatives like the LA Dodgers baseball team and Chelsea Football Club. If Towriss is a better figurehead and Walter brings financial power, then there is no need for Andretti beyond being able to use his name. Andretti Global was the route for these brands and GM to get into F1. But if the Andretti name itself is rightly or wrongly considered irrelevant to F1, how much is that really worth? We have to wonder if there's another potential play here, getting a GM Cadillac entry without the Andrettis. Decoupling GM from Andretti has been a topic in the F1 paddock for months already. A GM works team using the Cadillac name was clearly of interest to F1 because it left the door open to exactly that in 2028 when Andretti had hoped to enter for 2026. It was the Andretti side that seemed to come with doubts, and we understand at least one existing team on the grid had some tentative conversations about whether there might be interest in partnering with Cadillac should the Andretti entry fail to come off. So maybe there are fresh routes to pursue, especially as GM's Executive Director for Motorsports Competition Eric Warren has said that 2 years of work have gone into F1 and one way or another we're going to be there. The new Andretti-less Andretti era could try again by showing FOM how the change in leadership will allay the main concerns about the project's potential without being directly attached to the Andrettis after all. So could it be that Andretti Global becomes a vessel to facilitate a GM Cadillac only entry? If a new entry simply is not attainable, the alternative play would be to go all in on buying into an existing team. Red Bull's second team and Renault's Alpine entry are the logical targets. That could be done with or without Andretti branding as well, as long as there's other money behind it and GMs involved. Michael Andretti presumably opposed these paths given they weren't actively pursued. Maybe the new leadership will feel differently or find different opportunities are presented. We've mentioned a few times that Andretti Global has continued to publicly advance and expand its program despite its F1 rejection. This is in addition to political lobbying in its native United States that has been putting extra pressure on F1 owner Liberty. It's all been done with a 2026 entry in mind. Andretti has taken opportunities to stress how it has continued at pace, the phrasing used repeatedly in its few public comments this year. It had a model built to the current rule set in a wind tunnel as part of extensive work undertaken in the expectation it would be granted an entry for 26. It's also hired more than 100 members of staff, including ex-Renault man Nick Chester as technical director, and then, very interestingly, Pat Symonds from F1 itself. Symonds, who is now 70, was F1's chief technical officer and is a former tech chief at the likes of Benetton, Renault and Williams. He's been on gardening leave since being named Andretti's executive engineering consultant in May. While we could be ultra cynical and say Symonds is only going there for a payday before the project finally gets shut off, there's not much logic in that. He's been around the block so many times that he'll have known if this was about to get wound up in a couple of months, and if it was going to be shut down by the time he gets there or just after, what would be the point in joining? Symonds must have decided to go to the team thinking it had and presumably still has a good chance of being realised. Maybe he can play a key role in getting it over the line too, as he's respected, knowledgeable and has got great contacts, so he's a tangible asset as well. His move must also mean Symonds disagrees with F1's assessment that Andretti couldn't be competitive. Why would he go there if he thought that was going to be the case? And if one of F1's most senior individuals with among the most experience in that organisation of what it actually takes to succeed in F1 believes Andretti Cadillac can be successful, then it slightly undermines the FOM claim that this team couldn't be competitive. But if this is still all about 2026, then time is running out. Symonds hasn't started yet and the organisation is still immature. Proper aerodynamic development for 2026 can't start for any team until January 1st, 2025, but that's the only silver lining in terms of the timeline. It really depends how much progress has actually been made at the factories, how quickly an entry could be approved, and then how much and how quickly the project could be scaled up once it had the green light. There is of course the option of calling FOM's bluff and waiting until 2028, when the GM engine will be ready and it will be a proper works team, rather than have an interim period as a customer of a manufacturer forced to give it a supply deal under the FIA's rules that make sure no entry can be left without an engine. But waiting is not the preferred option, and while there are still so many hypotheticals and the timing is tricky, any potential opportunity to kickstart this F1 bid again will be seized by the parties involved. What we don't know right now is whether that will just be about reviving talks with FOM, having a less contentious figurehead to guide Andretti Global through the impasse, or even considering alternative routes onto the grid without the Andretti name.